The only anime of note that Sunao Katabuchi directed prior to In This Corner of the World was Black Lagoon, the show where they drove a boat up a ramp so that it could fire a torpedo into a helicopter mid-jump during episode 1 with blood and sex and violence everywhere. Studio Mappa's most famous work was still airing when the film was released, Yuri on Ice, which was famous for being an ice skating show that was both really gay and really gay. I naturally had concerns when going into this slice of life war film. My conclusion from the experience is that In This Corner of the World is one of my all-time favourite films and my outright favourite anime of the 2010s. How come nobody was talking about it? Your Name and a Silent Voice came out at around the same time as this, so I get that it was glossed over by the sheer spectacle of those films. Fine, but why was nobody talking about In This Corner of the World? All three movies were trying as hard as possible to be an emotional experience, and in that sense, the latter completely outdid the other two films. The only explanation I can think of comes down to the kind of movie it is. It feels more like a Japanese animated film than an anime. The usually blunt way of presenting characters and scenes, made to draw out as much emotion as possible, is replaced with a far more subtle approach. This isn't the kind of film where Pantsu-san gets flustered by Oni-chan's perverse nosebleed as she punts him off the screen while yelling "Baka!" You'll just get a really great animated film told from a Japanese perspective. If I had to compare the film to any creator or studio for those who haven't seen it yet, I would have to choose the works of Studio Ghibli. This claim probably surprises nobody, as any critic who wants to pretend they know anime typically compares anything in the medium to Miyazaki, seeing as he's the only guy they even know of, even if the director goes out of their way to separate themselves from this comparison. But I'm not associating anything within this movie to a Miyazaki film. Comparing it to the half of Ghibli that nobody cares about, Isao Takahata, would be far more apt, with Grave of the Fireflies being the film it resembles most narratively. Both movies are war films where sad things can happen. One of the ending shots of In This Corner of the World has a child abandoning her mother's rotting corpse as it's being eaten by maggots. If that doesn't display the horrors of war, then I don't know what does. The film somehow manages to make even this sadness feel justified, part of why I consider it superior to the beloved Grave of the Fireflies. Making people cry is an art in and of itself. The director focuses on maximising the emotions of one scene by playing the perfect music, having characters cry, and using great directing. If everything is done just right, then as long as you don't hate the characters, you'll probably cry and are therefore tricked into thinking that the show is well written or emotional, when it really just had one or two well done scenes. If you want to see somebody break down how pretentious a sad movie can really be, then I highly suggest you watch Bennett the Sage's review of Grave of the Fireflies. Keep in mind that watching this ultimately ruined the film for me. The overall takeaway I got from rewatching Grave of the Fireflies after that review, about 3 years ago, so take everything I say about it with a grain of salt, is that in all of its efforts to be a sad movie, which it definitely is, it's the only film that's ever made me cry, it did so not by making characters that I cared about, instead creating hollow containers of suffering. This is something that In This Corner of the World had no problem in balancing. The deceptively simple art style of the film immediately made me think of Takahata's other, more light-hearted movies, My Neighbours the Yamadas and The Tale of Princess Kaguya. I don't think a more appropriate way to present the world than its storybook-esque aesthetic exists. Suzu's still a child at heart. What better way to illustrate this than presenting the world as if it was one of the drawings she's so passionate about? Some of the best imagery in the film comes from viewing World War II Hiroshima through her eyes. Right off the bat, we're filled with a sense of childlike whimsy as we see her recount a story of her getting kidnapped by a monster. Once in its basket, she meets a boy whom she impresses with her resourcefulness as the two escape his clutches. This is quickly revealed to be nothing more than a story that she tells to impress her younger sister. Yet the film refuses to just leave this element as a one-off gag, made to allow us to easily understand the character's creativity and sense of fun. As we flash forward in time, Suzu eventually receives a request for an arranged marriage, and it's revealed that her fiancé was the same boy from the basket. Due to the overall realism of the film, I find it hard to believe that this fantastic event actually took place. They probably had a similar interaction at one point in time, minus the monster kidnapping, and the boy fell in love with Suzu. This desire to frame such an important moment in both of their lives in such a magical way is a perfect example of the film's light-hearted personality. By having such a welcoming and fun introduction to our characters, we can very easily care for them, so when the hardships of war, a place where the movie can still be playful if it chooses, affects them, we feel just as heartbroken as our characters. We don't feel bad because bad things are happening. We feel bad because they're happening to these characters. This is what sets it apart from Grave of the Fireflies. The tragedy that Seta and his sister went through made me cry, but the actual characters could have been replaced with two mouldy potatoes and I would have had the same emotional response, as long as they had similar traits of proud kid and cute sister. There was nothing that set the two apart from the overwhelming number of sad children in times of hardship characters. By having Suzu engage in an arranged marriage just as the war begins, we see her forced into a completely different lifestyle. We're introduced to an alternate family and neighbourhood as we quickly become accustomed to this new scenery along with her. The brief window we get into her childhood allows us to understand that this is a drastic lifestyle change for her, as well as establishing her clumsy nature and love of art. This passion leads to one of my favourite images in the film, as we see her perceive the explosions as slaps of paint across the sky. Her immature, optimistic desire for purpose in this war is brilliantly displayed here, making the horrific loss that she later has to endure even more painful. Her cry of frustration at the reveal of Japan's surrender mirroring that of Seta from Grave of the Fireflies, but with more nuance than his stunned realization of the falsity within the propaganda achieved. Suzu demands a reason, not for the loss, but the war. She demands an explanation for all the hardships everyone had to endure. The rationing, deaths and ruined homes couldn't have been for nothing. As much as she hated the war and wanted it to end, she desperately needed a Japanese victory, which wasn't what she got. I think the ending of the film best exemplifies the biggest difference between the mindsets of the two movies and why I prefer one so strongly over the other. Grave of the Fireflies had every main character die, ending on a shot of the Japanese youth returning from the safe locations they were hiding in. By ending on such a shallow and meaningless scene, it was basically telling the younger generation, see what we had to deal with. Your life wasn't as bad as ours, so don't come crying to me. In This Corner of the World has a much more optimistic mindset. Unlike the siblings in Fireflies that gave up and died, Suzu finds the motivation to continue on with her life, to keep battling and hope for a better tomorrow. Remember that throwaway shot of the little girl leaving her mother's corpse? She ultimately finds Suzu and decides that she'll be her new mother, a position that our protagonist agrees to wholeheartedly. There's no divide between these generations, no separation in their social classes. They've both suffered their own forms of hell and are coping as best as they possibly can to deal with it. There's an undeniable sense of hope and community that came from all their tragedies.